Yes.
Greetings and welcome to week 11. This week, as you know by now, we're going to discuss terrorism, international terrorism in specific, but also we are going to go through a history of the movement of terrorism from its roots in the French Revolution through to the Islamic terrorism which we associate with terrorism itself these days. When we think of terrorism often, especially if you're from the United States, you think of Osama bin Laden, you think of Al-Qaeda, you maybe think of Hamas and Hezbollah in Israel. But international terrorism's roots and tentacles are very wide. And the cover of one of the leading magazines in Brazil called Veja talks about the terror net in Brazil and how there are a number of operatives in Brazil who are dispersing propaganda from Osama bin Laden, who are recruiting actively, and who may be financing attacks and maybe even planning attacks here within the country. And so you go through this magazine and there is a great effort, not only by the government of the United States to understand the ramifications of terrorism in Brazil, but also from the government and the police forces of Brazil. So this week we are going to start with your lecture, and your lecture talks about terrorism itself, violence as a political tool. And the place where we start is in 1793, 1794 in France. And then you're going to be led through the history of terrorism up until about the second half of the 20th century, and the state-sponsored terrorism that had been spawned by the example of Nazi Germany and of certainly the Soviet Union, and had made its way to Latin America, to Argentina, to Chile, to Brazil. Then we'll get into the rise of Islamic fundamentalism and the rise of Islamic extremism. There are some pretty important names that are going to be at the center of our study this week. And the two really that you'll talk about, there's a guy named Anwar al-Awlaki. Now he is in Yemen, which adds a huge dimension to the political unrest in Yemen for the West, because the West looks at the political unrest in Yemen and they say, okay, if the government of Yemen fails, then what fills that vacuum? And will it be a group like the one that is led by Mr. al-Awlaki? Now, that is a question that we'll deal with, but he's a fascinating character because unlike Osama bin Laden, he is a U.S. citizen. He was trained as a student at Colorado State University, speaks fluent English, is very comfortable with the culture of the United States. So his goal from his base in Yemen seems to be to get people within the United States to convert to fundamentalist Islam and then to radicalize them to the point where they will launch terror attacks against the citizens and the government of the United States. He is a fascinating character, terrifying in many aspects, and he really has become, maybe even more so than Osama bin Laden, the new face of terror. That's what your situation brief, number 16 I believe, is called, The New Face of Terror, and it focuses on Anwar al-Awlaki. The second name that you're going to deal with is from a documentary called The Power of Nightmares, and the philosophical source, the leader, the inspiration for Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and al-Awlaki is a guy named Sayyid Qutb, who is an Egyptian, went to the United States in the late 1940s, and from the documentary that you'll watch a piece of, was disenchanted with the culture of the United States, didn't want it to affect the Islamic culture of Egypt, so he began to form the philosophical basis for the Islamic extremism that we see today, not only in the United States and Europe, but more and more all over the world, and as Veja illustrates this week, here in Brazil. So, You will start with your chapter 19 content, the history of terrorism. Then you will do your situation brief. You will watch about 6 minutes of the documentary called The Power of Nightmares, and specifically looking for information about Sayyid Qutb. As far as geography goes, Western Europe is our geography study of the week. There are 21 countries, I believe. So it's a fascinating week, because how you deal, and we've dealt with this earlier in the class, earlier in the week, but how do you deal with non-state actors that are determined to injure the people, the citizens, and the state itself? How do you deal with them, and how can you combat an enemy that can move, that can use the internet to deliver its propaganda and to gain recruits, that can blend in with local populations? Many of the people who they're concerned about here in Brazil live in the center of São Paulo, or live by one of the main tourist attractions in the southern part of the country, and they work in shops, they sell telephones, they do these, they seem to be a part of and they are a part of the fabric of the society of Brazil. But they also have another side where they are working to recruit, train, and give terrorists the ability to act in a violent way. It's a very difficult, very, very difficult situation to resolve, and it's a huge challenge for governments around the world. The final question, which is very controversial, by the way, is that you'll wrestle with in your journal is one man's terrorist another man's freedom fighter? So is there a part of the world that looks at somebody like Osama bin Laden and does not see the epitome of evil, as we see here in the West, but instead sees somebody who is fighting against the injustice of the Western nations, and really fighting for the freedom of his religion and the freedom of Islamic people everywhere? The answer is yes. There are hundreds of millions of people who see Osama bin Laden in that light. So how do you combat that? How do you deal with that difference in perspectives? And that's what you're going to deal with in your journal this week. Fascinating stuff. So have a good week. I will see you online. I will continue to work on grading your journals. Thank you so much for the good work that you're doing, and please let me know if you have any questions or concerns. I'll see you online. Have a good week.